Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and I'm doing a special series of talking supply chain with senior leaders to help senior leaders give advice to newer entry supply chain graduates and those that are looking to get in the supply chain space. Today, I'm interviewing Chris Gaffney, and Chris and I met when he was at Coca-Cola. And Chris, I think it was 16 years ago or so ago. So we're both kind of veterans and salty dogs of supply chain. And now Chris has retired from Coke and he's doing his own consulting. But Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Laura. And I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the great work that you are continuing to do in the field.
Well, thank you so much. So Chris, tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Super. So I am what I would say is a lifelong supply chain person. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I delivered the newspaper back in the day. And I did that for about 15 summers. And when I entered Georgia Tech at the School of Industrial and Systems Engineering, I explained that to a professor, and he said, "This is why you're becoming an engineer. You were trying to find a way to get something done in less time, with less effort, and with quality, and you worked that problem for 15 years. So I think I came by my interest in the field, honestly. I did get a bachelor and master's in industrial engineering at Georgia Tech, and then went into supply chain at Frito-Lay. And so my real capstones of my career were my, frontline formative experience working in plants and warehouses and with truck drivers at Frito-Lay, my exposure to international logistics at AJC International, and then, my 25 years at Coke. So the field's been very good to me, and I hope I'm still a student of the field of supply chain. Outside of that, my wife and I have been fortunate to raise 4 children who are now, good citizens in the world. I have 2 grandkids, and beyond my hobby of supply chain, I've been a long distance runner for 25 years. I'm not much good at it, but like my work, I'm very persistent about it.
Well, fabulous. And I know that you retired from Coke and now you're doing some consulting work, which I'm really happy to see, because I think there aren't enough people that are continuing to do the work in supply chain. But Chris, when you think about 25 years at Coca-Cola, I mean, that's a long time. And in that period, how many bosses did you work for, or organizational changes did you have?
Well, I think the boss count, is definitely between 10 and 15, and different cultures have different pace of organizational evolution, but I probably worked in between 15 and 20 different organizational design settings.
So each time something like that happens, you've got to manage your career and you've got to manage self and, build influence in a new organization. What advice would you have for the emerging supply chain leader about managing a career, not just today, but over time as they go through that kind of constant change?
Yeah, I think a few simple pieces of advice. I'm a huge fan of mentoring. And I think on the front end of your career, you may be on the receiving end of that, and mid and later in your career, you may have the opportunity to give back. But I think early on in your career, getting voices who can help give you a perspective, both internal to your organization and external, is helpful. So I think that's one. I think, being an adult learner is a second one in that. I think you have to realize you had the capability to learn in school and ladder up every year. And I think keeping that mindset through your professional career is important. You're always sharpening the saw. You're relevant and maintain your currency. I think that's important. I have found advice that has been good for me is kind of golden rule, is do unto others as you have people do to you. I think that's paid off well. And the last piece of advice I would give to people is you're interviewing for your next job every day. So every interaction matters. Somebody who might be a peer on a project team or someone you come into with infrequent content may ultimately have a big impact on you. So take care of all those interactions.
Let me dissect that a little bit. People are probably listening going, yeah, well, Chris worked for Coke and I bet they had a formal mentoring program. How did you go about getting a mentor? And, this whole process of having the experience of, being mentored to being a mentor, how did you make that work?
Yep. And I would say I was in my time at Coke, I was connected to formal mentoring programs. The vast majority of the most successful experiences I have come through informal mentoring. So I don't think it is dependent on that. I will tell you, I guess, two things. Number one, I've been fortunate. I've had some bosses who introduced me to people as part of my onboarding that those people became some of my potential mentors. So I've been very fortunate in that respect. But beyond that, taking the opportunity to interact with folks. My first mentor at Frito-Lay was a guy named Hill Latham who ran our backhaul program right at the beginning of deregulated freight in the US. And he was somebody I interacted with because I managed a fleet. He was probably my age, the age that I am now when I was in my early 20s. And our mentoring relationship began one afternoon when he saw me walking out of the office, and I just had a really difficult interaction with my boss. And he said, "You look like your dog just got run over." And we just chatted on the way to the parking lot. He gave me a very simple piece of advice, but that created a bond that lasted a long time. And so, you never know where you may come upon a mentor, but I think just interacting with lots of people in your sphere, you will ultimately find the right fit and make that ask and potentially develop a relationship that can last a long time.
So, informal mentoring, how does one manage self? Because I find that you have to be coachable and you have to listen and you have to want to be mentored. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's right. And again, having been on both sides of that coin, in an ideal state, if you're the mentee, you've marched down a path of being a bit more self-aware and, realized that everyone's got chinks in the armor and everyone has a blind spot. And if you've gotten to that point, then you can come into a relationship like that and say, I'd welcome the opportunity. I'm going to take care of the opportunity, which means I'm going to schedule the time. I'm going to create kind of a pact with you that is fair for both sides, what frequency matters, what's in scope, what's out of scope. And I'm going to manage the agenda. I'm going to come to you and say, I'm working on these things. Can we spend time on those? And I think if people are willing to do those simple things, you have a good chance of making that a productive and sustainable relationship.
So what's good advice that you got through that journey that you really cherish?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think early on, in many cases, in most cases, the ideal mentoring relationship is an additional relationship to the employee-manager relationship. And in many cases, the mentor can just provide you a different set of perspectives. And, the example I gave you first was a very challenging initial manager, and I lost some confidence. And I think, part of that initial advice was, A, this too shall pass. B, you actually are doing just fine. So kind of just take a breath and take a pause. So it may be some just perspective setting that may come from a relationship like that. It may be something more foundational. It may be, and it may have been for me, an honest point of feedback that says, do you really understand if we've established an open relationship that you've got an opportunity? Believe it or not, for me, early in my career, I talked too much and it wasn't productive in group settings. And one of my mentors had been in those settings with me, and he said, we've gotten to a point where I can let you know that this is holding you back. And I was able to receive that feedback in a way that even though it wasn't easy, I knew it was well intended and I became aware of it and I could start working on it.
And what did you do? How did you manage self?
Well, in that particular example, I started at the point of I had other peers who would be in settings with me. And I do think it's important in a development setting is to let people know what you're working on. It shows, that you're human. It kind of conveys the message that you're committed to development. And I had examples in that case where I had peers and I said, this is something I'm working on. I'm taking steps to improve. Will you tell me if you see this in the settings that we're in together and give me feedback on it? Now, beyond that, what I also did literally is I would say, if there are 10 people in the room, I can only speak 1 out of 10 times, and I would have a little check mark on my piece of paper. And once I checked 10, then I knew I could weigh in again. And that's the kind of thing that I did to manage self.
Beautiful. I love that advice. So let's just take a moment of reflection there, right? Let other people know what you're working on. That requires us to be a little naked, right? To share, but it also gives people permission to lovingly and jokingly help you along your journey, right? I grew up in a family of brothers with a lot of teasing, and I find that when I share what I'm trying to work on as a human, then, people kind of pull me along in fun ways.
I think that's absolutely the case. And, I think I said I'm a runner, and I learned early on from one of my running coaches is that if you were going to sign up for something like a marathon, the most important thing to do was to let your peer group know, because it set up an additional layer of accountability. Because once you did that, you knew they were going to come back and say, how did that race go? So I think the same thing applies in the personal development space.
So let's go back to something else that you said that I think is really meaningful, is treat each interaction like it's an interview for your next job. What does that mean? How do you modify your behavior? How do you manage self there?
Yeah, I think, the basics are, show respect for people, because their time is at stake. And so it may be something as simple as be prepared if you're coming into a setting. And it's very difficult in today's world where we're back to back all the time. But to walk into a team meeting or an occasional interaction with somebody and you're not ready for that setting, you can't be your best. So I think it's as basic as that. It's also being present. We all suffer from the whole mindset of trying to multitask, which is I was accused of being really good at it early in my career, and then I read that it's physically impossible. So, but being present in an interaction, which also I think shows respect to people. And then in those group settings, there's always more work to be done, and everyone always has a full plate. And I think part of this is managing self is also managing your own personal productivity with a level of discipline that you've always got bandwidth to take on a piece of the work in an interaction. So when you're in that setting, talk 1/10 of the time, but at least take 1/10 of the action items so you can help the effort move forward. Those are some pieces of advice I have given myself over the years.
All right, now let's kind of flip the glass the other way. Now, through your career, you started out building skills to be mentored, and then later in your career, you became a mentor. What did you learn in the process of mentoring others?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've had some mentors who I think have been very successful, and I frankly have some others who, over the course of a long time with them probably haven't made the progress that maybe they could have. I think from early to late, I probably learned to give more impactful feedback to folks, is, in a nice way. You're not doing them a favor if you're not giving them honest feedback. And maybe in this person's situation, they were looking to develop skills and ability, but they weren't having enough business impact. And I probably spent more time on their curiosity about learning more. And I didn't get in front of them and saying, let's be honest, are you able to have the business impact that you want? Do you believe others feel the same way? And can we talk about what's holding you back? So I probably now am more comfortable giving somebody what I would call kind of tough-minded but well-intended feedback, because it's a safe environment.
All right. Now, Chris, I know from working alongside you, I would meet you at Coke and we worked on some projects, not really deep, but, we've probably crossed paths for off and on for 15, 18 years, right?
Yep.
And I've watched you be a continual learner in supply chain. and really worked on developing your skills. I would say that you were asking really good questions as an early adopter. How did you manage your career, and what are the sources of learning that you reached out for, and what would you advise others to do in terms of personal growth?
Yep. I would say first, I'm pretty humble. And what that implies for me is I'm always looking for folks who are ahead of where I am and trying to get myself in settings where I can benefit from those who have already put some breadcrumbs down on the table or down on the path that I can follow. So that is implied for me to be externally oriented. And no matter how progressive your setting is, I think an external orientation really helps. I have been part of, collaborative work groups at a university setting. I've done my fair share in some of the industry efforts, CSCMP, those type of things, to both give and receive. And I think that's allowed me to be exposed to new worlds that were out there and then take action about it. And I'll give you an example of mine. Machine learning is a great example of one of those areas that, from starting in the analog era of supply chain, now in the digital age, I understood enough, from my background to say there's a lot of leverage here, but I don't need this space to be a black box for me. How can I address that? And we were working with a vendor who was progressive in that space. And ironically, someone who had worked for me had gone to work for that vendor and really stepped forward in the field. Very young in the field, actually had co-opted for us. And I said, I need a coach in this space. Would you coach me? Here he was, probably 20 years my junior. And he and I have had that relationship for the last 3 and 4 years. He gave me some reading. We would have periodic sit downs. We would talk to some things. He actually gave me some data sets to work on. So I think it comes from humility and an external orientation. The best advice for me to stay current in the field.
It's horrible when you're working with people that believe that they always know the answer, are not good listeners, not open to learning. So I think that's great advice. Any other insights or advice that you would have as we close the show today?
Yeah, it's, an overall life lesson for me is the more you give back, the more you receive. And people hear that in various settings, but it's been proven to me so much. And like I say, I don't make bones about it that, what I and my family have are because I've been in this field. And I had a boss one time who said, people have been moving stuff since Marco Polo, so it's a good field to be in. And, this is the supply chain space is making and moving products and services around the world. So I feel an obligation to the craft, and I'm constantly gratified by anything I give comes back in excess. So I would just have people have a little faith in that, and good things will come.
Yes. Real relationships. One of the things I've really always admired about you, Chris, is the fact that, when you talk to you, you feel like you're really listening and trying to build a relationship. And I think there's just so much to that human element that we don't think enough about and talk enough about.
Yeah, this work is hard. I remember early in my career, you've always been with revenue side people when you're on the supply chain, and whether it's a football analogy of the person who's running the ball or the person who's blocking, you come into the supply chain field knowing it's fascinating, but it's hard work, and you're the one who can get it on the chin a lot. And so I've always felt that making it human, it's not just work, right? But you have to have empathy for folks. Everyone's been on the other side of the coin of being supplier and customer. And I've always felt like in the supply chain space, it's legitimate, authentic empathy. And if you can, in that interaction internally or with a customer, supplier, peer, help people along with their day, they've been where you are. And so I think that is actually something unique about the field we practice in.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. This is Lora cecere closing the session with Chris Gaffney on insights for building supply chain careers. My name is Lora, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and I want to give you a personal invitation to join this year's Supply Chain Insights Global Summit. Now in its 8th year of doing this conference, we designed this for a unique experience for supply chain leaders to learn from technology leaders to think differently and drive new outcomes. We're hoping that you can make it on September 7th through the 9th in Franklin, Tennessee. In the conference, we handpick all of the speakers and we design the conference for a unique networking experience so that you leave to build a guiding coalition for change. We hope to see you there.